And joining us now to discuss the aftermath of the September 11th attacks and the U.S. response is Jason Blazakis. He's a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center and a former counterterrorism official at the State Department. Jason, thank you so much for being with us and welcome back to U News.
Good to see you, Andres.
So we just heard former President Bush give an ultimatum for nations to join the fight against terrorism that day that he was declaring war. Was this goal of eradicating international terrorism achieved in the long run?
So my answer to this question is really complex. The answer is both yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the United States homeland is extremely hardened against external enemies like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The United States was essentially abused by Al-Qaeda in terms of its airport security. U.S. aviation security is at an all-time high. It's impossible nearly to try to smuggle in box cutters and knives. And the United States failed in information sharing on 9/11. The big reason why 9/11 happened in many eyes of experts is that the CIA and the FBI weren't sharing information with one another. Now, information sharing has improved. But on the other hand, the threat has changed, it has morphed, it has grown considerably. At 9/11, you had Al-Qaeda. There was no ISIS. Post 9/11, you have Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda affiliates throughout the globe in places like Yemen and Somalia and North Africa. And then, of course, the rise of ISIS, especially during the Syrian civil war. So we have a different kind of threat. And then we now have, of course, left Afghanistan, and the Taliban has taken over, and that can make a fertile ground for a resurgent Al-Qaeda and potentially for ISIS as well to grow.
Now, on another note, you recently argued in the Washington Post that the greatest threat may actually come from within. And you wrote the following, I quote, "The U.S. war on terror launched in the wake of 9/11 has left U.S. unprepared for the domestic threat that grows by the day. Complicating matters further is that in today's politically charged environment, the Biden administration will find it difficult to pivot toward the domestic threat." Can you elaborate on your point here?
So my main point is what we saw on the 6th of January, in my mind, is the first strike by an eclectic mix of domestic extremists that include anti-government groups like the Oath Keepers and Three Percenters on the one hand, and then a hodgepodge of white supremacists on the other, interlaced with conspiracy theorists like QAnon. They reject President Biden. They see him as an enemy. They think the election was stolen. And because of that political animus, the United States is at a great risk of these extremists to try to carry out additional events. And of course, President Biden has made a couple of new decisions, really good decisions in my mind, to require the federal workforce to be vaccinated and to request that businesses of more than 100 people have their employees also vaccinated. And this may trigger anti-vaxxers on the far right of the spectrum to carry out acts of violence as well. So I am really worried about this domestic threat. And the domestic threat's more difficult to challenge as well for the federal government for various reasons. We have tools in place to handle groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and those same tools don't necessarily apply to domestic extremists today. We don't have the same laws in place and the same capabilities, and that's another reason why the domestic threat is more challenging.
Now, in terms of tactics, in your piece, you outlined some important steps to help tackle domestic terrorism. Can you give us a couple of examples? How so? How would it be done?
So one example is the FBI, until just very recently, had about 80% of its special agents looking at the international terrorism threat. And that's changing. They're improving, but to a point where they're not treating the domestic threat quite at that same level still as the international threat. And it takes a while to pivot law enforcement resources to get them to develop new networks and sources of information. So we're really behind the 8 ball in the context of law enforcement personnel being devoted to domestic extremist investigations. The second point I would want to make is that it's not just a U.S. government approach that has to be taken. It's a whole of humanity approach. It requires private citizens to be educated about conspiracy theories so they're not manipulated by far right-wing recruiters. And that really requires social media companies to step up, the Facebooks of the world, the Twitters of the world, to shut down mis and disinformation that may be radicalizing the American population.
Now, finally, you argue that America's domestic extremists and the Taliban seem like polar opposites, yet they have many things in common. Among them, their approach to recruiting and financing. Can you expand upon that?
So they're both really adept at social media use. They cheer each other on. There's white supremacists who have cheered on the Taliban because they see the Taliban taking their own destiny in their own hands. And a lot of the radical right in the United States want to take the destiny in their own hands as well, just like the Taliban. And they recruit over social media. They amplify messages, and they try to lure individuals to their milieus. And they try to do so in really innocent ways. If you were looking at the Taliban use of social media in the last week or so, you'll see that they're trying to tout the fact that they're different from where they were 20 years ago, that they're somehow going to provide women's rights and minority rights. But in practice, that's not really happening. In white supremacist communities, the radical right communities, they do these same kinds of things as well, try to lure people to make their message seem more normalized when it really isn't.
Well, thank you so much for all this information. Jason Blazakis of the Soufan Center. Take care.
Great to see you. Take care.
Likewise.